Hello everybody and welcome to Sakama's webinar. I'll be starting in just a second. I'm just going to arrange all my windows and my presentation and things, and then we'll get going. So last minute for those who want to grab coffees and things like that. Okay, I've got my presentation on this screen. I've got the chat on that screen. I've got my phone in front of me should anything go wrong and the team need to let me know that I've screwed something up. So we'll be starting in just a second. Okay, it looks like I'm good to go. I'm getting streaming good. We're not dropping any frames, so we should be good to start. Hello everybody, welcome to Sakama's first webinar that we're doing through this platform. So this is the first time that I've used this platform, and it's the first time that Sakama have done a webinar like this. So no doubt we're going to have a technical difficulty at some point. I've got my team standing by on the chat in front of me. So if anything goes wrong, bear with us for the minute or two that it takes me to work out there's a problem and then work out how to fix it. I've also got the live chat open on the second monitor here. So as we go through the content, if you want to ask questions and things like that, feel free to do so. I'll pick them up as soon as I can as we go through the content. I'll also stop at the end for questions, those kinds of things. It'll be a short presentation, this one. I've got 20 slides, and I'm going to run you through brief history of firewalls, why firewalling is relevant to penetration testing, internal infrastructure. I will talk very briefly at the end about kind of new technology stuff, so web application firewalls, that kind of thing as well. And then we'll take questions. So to get started, just in case people are new to Sakama or they've never seen me speak before, I'll do a brief introduction to who I am, a brief introduction to who Sakama are, just in case you don't know who we are. And then I'm just going to talk about technology, and really I'm going to try and talk about my favorite thing, which is computer hacking. So not really a sales event. We sell these things. You know, if you want to talk about penetration testing, those kinds of things, then that's what we do. That's our core service. But I'm just going to talk about technology. I'm just going to try and concentrate on the firewalls and those kinds of things. But the social media links are there should people want to connect. On the last slide of the presentation as well, I'll have the social media links again for Sakama. So if you get to the end of the presentation, enjoyed it, had a question but don't have time to hang around for the Q&A at the end, feel free to fire us the questions on either Twitter or LinkedIn is just fine. So I'm talking about firewalls, and firewalls have been around for like a really long time. In fact, it comes about in a lot of organizations now that some of the technologies that we use, firewalling technology, that kind of thing, have been around longer than a lot of staff members have been alive. You know, when you look at things like firewalling technology being developed in the 1980s, you'll have staff members who that's you know, older than they are, effectively. I think it's surprising to some people when they look into the background of a lot of these things that a lot of the technology, a lot of the fundamental work being done in the 80s for computing means that it's a lot older than people expect it to be. The one that I usually give an example for in the kind of hacking side of things is ransomware. Everybody talks about ransomware as if it's something new, but the earliest version of ransomware that I'm aware of was the AIDS Trojan, which came out in 1989. These things are certainly not new, and that's true of firewalling as well. Depending on who you listen to and depending on what specifically you consider the first firewall, they were developed in the late 80s, so they've been around for a long time. We're going to talk about firewalls in the context of penetration testing today, though. So just in case we've got people who are not intimately familiar with the security testing, how those kinds of things work, I'll do a very brief introduction to what I'm talking about penetration testing and why that might be relevant in the context of firewalls. And then I'm going to talk about a selection of times in which firewalls are relevant. Really, I'm trying to dispel the common misconception that firewalls are a thing that sit at the network perimeter. I'm going to try and dispel this in two ways. I'm going to dispel the fact that there really even is a network perimeter in modern networks. And then the second thing is that you would just have a firewall at the perimeter and not elsewhere within the network. But before we jump into that stuff, I'm going to be talking about penetration testing. Sakama's core service is penetration testing. We're a cybersecurity consultancy, so we do help on the building side of things. We do help on the consultancy side in terms of maturity assessments, those kinds of things. But our key core service is penetration testing. That's the breaking into computers and buildings side of things. So you can see how firewalls are relevant here, of course, because they're a very, very common, very mature, well-established defensive technology. So when it comes to pretty much any of the penetration testing types that we do, there's going to be a firewall to some degree. Very often we think of firewalling just in terms of packet filtering, where it's blocking network traffic, but I do have a slide in here to talk about web application firewalls as well, or layer 7 firewalls, application firewalls, however you want to call them. Talk about WAFs, web application firewalls, right at the end to talk about how they're relevant to application security as well. So when I talk about penetration testing, I'm really talking more broadly about security testing in general. So I might conflate pen testing and red teaming together in the context of this conversation, but just so that it doesn't confuse people at my pure use of the terminology. Penetration testing is a human-led scope-restricted security test of a system. It's the hacking side of things. And typically with a penetration test, what we're looking to do is break into a computer system to demonstrate business risk. So we might try and breach an organization's perimeter to find some vulnerabilities, gain access to sensitive data, and then demonstrate that that business is at risk, with, of course, the end goal there being to walk that back to how can that organization operate more securely? How do you fix those vulnerabilities? On the other side of this slide, we had red teaming. Red teaming is distinct. Reasonable adults will disagree with where exactly the line is here, but this is the definition that I'm going to use throughout this presentation, which is a human-led, multi-technique security test of a system, combining technical, physical, and social attacks, where it's intending to assess an organization's response. So the two keywords here, multi-technique and assess an organization's response. So the first thing there, multi-technique, we're talking about not just hacking side of things, not just trying to break the perimeter technically, but combining things like phishing assessments, combining things like physical access assessments. So when I talked earlier about how you shouldn't necessarily think of firewalls just in the context of perimeter security, if we're doing a physical access assessment and we can gain access to a building, an office space, something like that, we can plug a device into the network, we'll be on the inside of your internal corporate infrastructure. And if you only have a firewall at the perimeter, then you're not gaining the defensive benefit of having a firewall. So red teaming brings out some of those risks, and it's worth looking at in this context. And then the final thing there being intending to assess an organization's response to a real-world attack. One of the things we're going to talk about in the context of network segmentation is it's really important to block an attack. Of course it is. It's really important to prevent somebody from being able to demonstrate that business risk. But it's also really important to know that that attack took place, know where the threat actor was, the actions that they took. So we'll talk a little bit about logging and monitoring. I'm not going to dwell on that, but it's going to be relevant within the context of network architecture and network segmentation. So that's the brief introduction to who we are and what we do. I mentioned firewalls have been around a long time. I've kind of copped out here and just said dating to the 1980s, because depending on who you listen to, it differs. But it's the second half of the 1980s. And the earliest firewall technology was very, very simple. I refer to it here as packet filtering. So this is a network layer. If you're an OSI model fan, we're talking about blocking on things like IP addresses, blocking on things like port numbers, TCP or UDP, those kinds of things. They developed from there to become stateful, so that they could block in both directions and would be aware when a connection was established, so that they could allow the return traffic through. And then building up to more modern application layer devices, so web application firewalls, those kinds of things. I'll talk about how web application firewalls can frustrate pen testers in the context of application security right at the very end. And then I'll also tell you about how our own web application firewall got in the way of business right at the very end. Because there is a counterpoint to, of course, this conversation where I'm talking about restricting network traffic and trying to restrict the movements of a penetration tester in terms of getting that good balance between, yes, blocking a threat actor or a hacking crew or whatever term you prefer for the bad guys, and on the other hand, making it so that the business can operate effectively and efficiently. So two sides to the story, and I'll try and give a fair discussion around implementing some of these protective measures in a way that won't disrupt the business too much, or ideally to a user, they won't even notice that you're doing it. So firewalls, been around for a long time. That's what I'm going on about here. First part then, I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to talk about firewalls and the network perimeter. So when I talk about the network perimeter, I guess this has changed a little bit with the coronavirus pandemic. I'm not going to dig into coronavirus and how it's affected the ways that people work and being on second lockdown now, I guess, and everybody working from home. I think a lot of virtual events have covered that. All I want to mention is the fact that where you draw the perimeter depends on where your end user devices are, where your staff are operating from. And if you have staff that are operating remotely, then it does bring into this context things like VPNs. It does bring into this context whatever remote working solution you have, be it RDS, RDP, VPNs, whatever. There's a lot of different technologies out there, and that can change where the perimeter is. But first of all, what I'm talking about here is, where do you draw the line? A lot of organizations will have a network diagram where they have a firewall at the internet-facing perimeter, and then on the inside they'll have a lot of devices. We'll talk about network segmentation on the internal in a second, so hopefully you wouldn't just have everything in a big pile on the right-hand side like we have here. You would segment based on trust level, geographic region, whatever. But right now, what I'm talking about is just the perimeter side of things. A lot of people think of the firewall as the furthest extent that their organization has, the perimeter. I don't really agree with that when we look at things like VPN technology. And what I'm talking about here is, if you have devices that access the network remotely, so staff members who are at home on their home wireless network, something like that, and they're connecting through their own Wi-Fi, where their device is using a VPN, host-based VPN connection, the line might be further out than you think it is. So if there was an infected device on their home Wi-Fi network, that infected device could communicate with the end user device, and therefore that might effectively make the perimeter those external end user devices. It's something that's worth thinking about, especially in the context of VPNs and where you do your logging, where you consider the perimeter to be, and how you make sure that you know what's happening. I'll talk about logging a little bit more in depth, but recently I was doing a security assessment with a customer, and they had an externally facing portal. And that portal allowed for file transfer. You could effectively access your home drive, that kind of thing. And it turned out that that organization, whilst they had some degree of restriction to prevent brute forcing attack, it wasn't an account lockout. I think they were a little bit worried, and it's a fair concern that if a threat actor was to perform a brute force attack that locked accounts out, it would be possible to do a denial of service attack. Just lock all of the accounts by doing an arbitrary brute force. They were concerned by that, so what they did instead was use something like the observation window. What this is, and it's a very common thing, the observation window within account logins, but it's not talked about a lot within the context of security. The default feature of Windows Active Directory accounts, for example. The observation window is a part of account lockout where what it states is not a definite number of attempts before an account locks, but a number of attempts within a certain period of time. So you could say, this user will lock out after 5 incorrect password attempts, or you could say it would lock out after 5 password attempts within 30 minutes. Or you could have it where it locks itself and then unlocks itself again after a certain period of time, or where an administrator is required to unlock it. In this case, for this customer that we're doing a security assessment for, it happened that they had the observation window. Like I say, it's a suggested setting for Active Directory. If I remember correctly, the default is 5 attempts within 30 minutes. What that means from the threat actor's point of view, or for us from the pen tester's point of view, it meant we could perform a brute force attack. We just had to make sure that we did less than 5 attempts every half an hour. So that's 4 attempts every half an hour, or 192 attempts per day per user account. Turns out that's quite a lot of attempts, especially if you have quite a lot of users. We launched a brute force attack against this company's externally facing portal, and it took a long time. It took a few days to get an account, but they were, didn't have that protection in place. They weren't using multi-factor authentication. They were just relying on having strong passwords and a strong policy. It turns out that strong password policies don't always work, and if you block things like common passwords, password 123, summer 2020, those kinds of things, users might just find something bad. In this particular case, the password that I managed to guess was lockdown 2020. It wasn't on their common password list, but you can see why in this day and age, with the world currently on fire, that I might try that as a possible password. It worked, gained access to their portal, and we were able to access some users' home drives. For them, the big issue there was they just weren't logging that stuff, and they didn't realize that that kind of thing could take place. So some of the stuff we'll talk about throughout this presentation is going to be just kind of revisiting these things. Everybody already knows what firewalls are. Everybody already knows what firewalls are used for. They're for blocking connections, be them application layer or network layer. But let's take another look at some of the things that firewalls can do and how we can review them as a service. But firewalls at the perimeter. Where do you draw the line? If you're drawing the line, the perimeter of your network at the firewall, consider those remote end user devices. If I can connect to a user's home Wi-Fi, or I guess more likely if that user has another device on the same Wi-Fi network which is infected, they've fallen for a phishing email, or maybe on their home laptop they don't install patches and things like that as rigorously as your own internal IT team does. You might get some weaknesses, and that might allow us to attack the external end user device, and therefore that's effectively pushing the perimeter out. So it's just something to concern, and I guess that's the starting point for digging deep into firewall security. I mentioned, though, that firewalls shouldn't just be on the external of the network. You should have firewalling internally. So I'm going to talk about firewalling for network segmentation. And what I'm talking about here is separating the network up into pieces to prevent threat actor propagation. So when it comes to network segmentation, what I want you to think of is if a threat actor was successful and they compromise a device and they get a foothold on the network, be it they compromise one of the VPN devices like we talked about a second ago, or be it you have a remote access system like MSRDS or something like that, and they manage to compromise an account on that. The threat actor will need to propagate across the network, because it's unlikely that basic user who's fallen for a phishing email or something like that has a great amount of access to the internal network. We're probably going to want to target some servers. We're probably want to gain access to things like the file server. We're probably going to want to gain access to things like Active Directory and do attacks across the network. When it comes to network segmentation, it's incredibly rare to see it implemented, and where it is implemented, it's incredibly rare to see it done well. For many organizations, when we talk about network segmentation with them, when we look at things like cybersecurity maturity assessments, those kinds of things. So just in case you're unfamiliar with maturity assessments, it's kind of assessment where we go in and we look for an organization, how they've designed security, how they've implemented security, how they would detect an incident if attack had taken place, if a device is infected by malware, something like that, and then how they would recover from that incident. We do the kind of full life cycle for security. The reason we do that, of course, is whilst penetration testing is great, it's quite a narrow view of an organization's security. When we do these cybersecurity maturity assessments, we look for where the design and the implementation don't necessarily match up. Like, hey, you have a policy that says this, but how you've actually implemented it says something completely different. And when it comes to network segmentation, we ask questions around, do you have network access control? How is the network segmented? And very often some customers will talk to us about things like VLANs. They'll talk to us about logical segmentation within the network. So they might have a VLAN for phones, a VLAN for laptops, a VLAN for printers, those kinds of things. But what we really mean about network segmentation is what access control lists exist to prevent those devices talking to each other. And for a lot of organizations, yes, they've logically separated the network into VLANs, but there's no actual access control between them. So it's not segmentation, not in this context that we're talking about it here. I've also added, of course, this strapline, where do you draw the line? So what I'm talking about in terms of network segmentation is, as you have a bigger network, the more segmented you can make that network, the more rigorous the access control between areas of the network, the harder it is for a threat actor to propagate. But where you draw the line can be important. So to give a couple of examples, you could perform network segmentation geographically. So you could have it so that each of your office spaces had strict access control between them. You could perform it based on device type. So you could have, as this slide shows here, phones on one area, end user devices on another area, and segment it that way. Or you could segment based on trust level. So the guest Wi-Fi network should be segmented from the corporate network, ideally entirely isolated, but we'll get to that in a second. And then you should have servers segmented from user devices, segmented from printers. Segmentation in this context doesn't have to mean entirely isolation. In some cases, it really should. So the guest Wi-Fi probably should be entirely isolated from the internal corporate network. But if you have a network segment where printers are installed and a network segment where user devices are, you could allow some traffic between those, but you should restrict that traffic just to, well, effectively printing, right? And the more restrictive you can be at those areas of the network, the harder it can be for us to move between them. So I was doing a security assessment recently for a retail organization, and they have, as you can imagine, many physical stores that didn't have network segmentation between their locations. So it is possible that somebody who could visit a store and gain access to a network device. This could be a member of staff. It could be a visitor who is able to, sneak into a back room and plug something in. It could be a contractor who's working temporarily, those kinds of things. And then, of course, there's all the physical access testing stuff that I mentioned earlier, the breaking into buildings part of our job. If you're able to gain access to any of their retail store network connections, you could then propagate across the network to all other stores. So what I'm talking about in this context of network segmentation is preventing that kind of thing. Drawing boundaries to prevent propagation, drawing boundaries to prevent threat actors from being able to move across the network. But where you draw the line is pretty important. If you want to see some good real-world examples, if you have a well-segmented network and you think, surely everybody's segmenting the network to a strong degree, we are. Some good examples of that would be looking at things like the NotPetya attack. So NotPetya was a piece of malware, if you haven't heard about it. It came out about a month after WannaCry in 2017. And it was very similar to WannaCry, so it didn't necessarily get the same level of media attention, but it propagated using PSExec. So it's propagating as command line access over TCP 445, which is file access. So a lot of networks either had file access just allowed between end user devices, they had no segmentation at all, or they had allowed that port through thinking, well, user devices are going to want to connect to file shares and therefore we should allow it across the network. That allowed NotPetya to spread across the network very, very, very quickly, and some major organizations had several thousand infections because of that attack. So what we're talking about network segmentation here would be, as a first step, can we block at a network level? If you don't require that traffic at all, if you have user devices on one hand and printers on the other, can you just block everything other than the printing ports? And then we'll build up to talk more about application layer firewalling. So not only can you block at the port level, but can you differentiate between types of traffic that might occur over that link? So I mentioned TCP 445 can be used for file transfer on Windows systems, or it can be used for PSExec, which is command execution. It's a remote administrative tool. So being able to differentiate between traffic is important. Also, being able to differentiate between where those connections take place. So you might want end user devices to be able to do file transfer to the file server, but not to each other, for example, or not to other servers. So the more granular you can get that filtration, the harder it will be for a threat actor to propagate. And this is the thing when it comes to internal networks. Honestly, in my experience, and I've done a lot of internal network assessments, either directly where we've gone to customers and plugged into the network, as part of a physical access where we've snuck into the building and plugged into an internal network, or where we've compromised the perimeter through some other attack, breaching a VPN or something like that, and then we gain access to the internal. Very, very common for internal corporate networks to be squishy on the inside. So network segmentation will help to a great degree with that, and firewalling is the way to do that. Don't just think in terms of network engineering and VLANs, but think in terms of how do we restrict traffic, and how do we restrict traffic granularly. One thing to point out here, I don't see a lot of people talking about it, and sometimes when I bring it up in conversation, some people get confused a little bit by what I mean. But it's very, very common for organizations to have network segmentation between their guest Wi-Fi and their internal corporate network, but for that network air gap to be bridged unintentionally. So where this most frequently happens is where there is a guest Wi-Fi network that staff members can connect their laptops to if they want to surf the internet, that kind of thing. There's different policy reasons why this might occur. You might have a very restrictive internal firewall that prevents surfing the internet, but staff members might be allowed to surf on their breaks, those kinds of things, so they connect to the guest Wi-Fi to do their, check their Facebook or their Twitter or what have you. Some organizations, when they first build staff devices, will connect them to the guest Wi-Fi so they can install all of the patches, updates, security tools before they connect it to the more sensitive corporate network, those kinds of things. But then they don't prevent those devices from connecting to the guest Wi-Fi again once they've been provisioned and they're connected to the internal corporate network. So where we very frequently see this is a user will have reconnection successful. There we go. Sorry, slight quirk there, but it looks like we're back at it. Okay, just to cover that in case you lost a few seconds there, it's very, very common for organizations Okay. I'm being told I'm reconnected, so I'm going to try and persist. Okay, so sorry for that if you lost a couple of minutes. I'll briefly go back over what I was saying when the connection dropped, and then I'll carry on. So it's really common on internal corporate networks for us to find devices that bridge the air gap. So this is where a laptop is physically connected to an internal corporate network. So generally they're plugged into a docking station, or they've connected a cable to their laptop, and their laptop is also connected over Wi-Fi to their guest Wi-Fi network. So what this means is, as a threat actor, if we have access to the guest Wi-Fi network, we can jump the air gap into the internal corporate network. There's a couple of different ways of dealing with that as a vulnerability. The first, of course, on your guest Wi-Fi is to look at things like host isolation. An alternative thing, of course, is to handle it with something like group policy. On group policy, you can do an allow list or a deny list for which wireless networks the devices can connect to. So once you've provisioned the device and it's joined on the domain and it's going to connect to the corporate network, you can effectively block that device from connecting to the guest Wi-Fi network again. So that's something to consider. It's incredibly common, and it's also very frustrating for IT teams if they see us bridge a network like this and then we're off into the internal corporate network, bypassing firewalling and those kinds of things. But it's a great attack to consider. So firewalls for segmentation are great, but consider that modern devices, laptops, can have two network connections, and a physical one to the corporate network and a Wi-Fi one to the guest Wi-Fi is definitely not uncommon. Something I mentioned earlier was monitoring of the network, and I said that it's really important to consider the actions of a threat actor, of a hacker, as two things. You want to, of course, block an attack taking place, so access control list, network filtration to prevent them from being able to propagate, that kind of thing. But also, if something suspicious happens, you want to know that it's happened so you can take action. So monitoring the situation, what I'm talking about here is consider how your devices communicate and how they communicate with each other. It's very common for customers to have, again, perimeter firewalls that are controlling the connection from the internal corporate network out to the internet. But at a internal network level, they'll have, say, an access control layer with perhaps switching, layer 2 or layer 3 switching, where end-user devices can connect directly to each other without flowing through the firewall. They don't necessarily need to flow through the firewall. However you architect your network is up to you, as long as you consider how do you monitor those data flows. So for example, if a threat actor is connecting from one user device to another user device, would you be able to see what kinds of traffic they're using, how are they connecting? Give you a good example of where this is relevant. Something like link local multicast name resolution spoofing. Okay. Link local multicast name resolution spoofing is an incredible mouthful. For short, you can say LLMNR spoofing, but that's also an incredible mouthful. So I'm going to refer to link local multicast name resolution spoofing as overly friendly DNS. Overly friendly DNS, it's a multicast protocol. It's used very often by threat actors with common attack tools. You can do it with a Metasploit framework. You could do it with a tool called Responder. What it allows you to do is, using multicast traffic, intercept connections between end-user devices. So if a end-user device goes to connect to a file share or something like that, if that device, if the user typos the name, something like that, instead of connecting to your DNS server, because of course the DNS server won't know where the file server is if the user has mistyped the address and it's a server that doesn't exist, what will happen by default on Active Directory systems, on Windows systems, is it'll fall back to LLMNR, overly friendly DNS, and it'll effectively shout out to the network using multicast to see if any of the other devices know where the server is effectively. It's a very, very common attack for us, and it's a great way of stealing credentials. You can do it for more in-depth attacks. You can do SMB relay through this, but as a very simple option, tools like Responder, very simple to run. It's a freely available hacking tool from the internet. You run it on a device. It will listen to the local network for multicast requests. It will respond to those multicast requests and cause an interception attack. And then if the user tries to log in, which they would typically do by default if you're mapping a file share or something like that, your device will use your Active Directory credentials by default on your behalf, single sign-on, right? It will send those credentials to the threat actor's machine. So the fact that that's happening, let's say effectively like a client machine to client machine interaction, an end user device to end user device interaction, that might happen entirely at the access layer. So how do you monitor those data flows? How do you monitor for those kinds of things? If a device, a user device is doing port scans of the servers, you might see that because you might have your network architected in such a way that that traffic would flow through the firewall and you're effectively logging it. But if a threat actor is port scanning other user devices, how do you monitor those? So making sure that you can pick everything up not only between network segmentation, between device types, but also inter-device communications. How do you monitor data flows? That's really, really important. Very often when we talk to customers, in my experience, they can tell us not necessarily as much detail about the attack as they necessarily expect. So I was working with a customer recently. We performed this LLM&R attack, the overly friendly DNS attack on their internal network, and their monitoring solution told them that an attack had taken place. They got a notification within their security system that effectively said something along the lines of suspicious multicast traffic. But that was it. It's like, hey, an attack has taken place. Okay, the key details following on from that would be, was the attack successful? What was the end result of that attack? In this case, it was credential theft, and it could feasibly be credential theft of administrative credentials as well. That's the thing we're aiming for with attacks like that. Or like I say, it could be something like an SMB relay attack. Again, another common internal network attack that we would use for this kind of thing on an internal infrastructure assessment. If you can't tell that those things took place, then knowing an attack took place, yeah, it's okay, but it's going to make the incident detection, minimizing impact side of the maturity assessment that I talked about earlier, it's going to make that look pretty bad. So yeah, step one is blocking the attack where possible. Step two is knowing an attack took place, but where do you get the granular detail from? So you should think if you're re-architecting your networks, maybe if you don't have network segmentation, you're looking to implement it, try and look at how do you monitor the data flows as well. There are other ways, of course. At the access layer, you could use something like span ports. So there's for those who've never heard the term span before, effectively monitoring ports at a switch level where you can feed them into something like an intrusion detection system. Those are cool. It's just something to consider. And I did say that right at the end, I talk about application layer firewalls. So we've had some fun this week with application layer firewalls, but just in case you've only really worked on network firewalls and never worked with layer 7 firewalls, or web application firewalls, WAFs, they are another level of granularity. So application layer firewalls are aware of the protocol specifically. I'm kind of glossing over some of the details here around things like deep packet inspection and how that's different from application layer firewalls, where the line is between those kinds of things, just for the sake of brevity. But application layer firewalls are really, really good. And very often you'll hear penetration testers tell you that application layer firewalls are a bit useless, or they're very often not a perfect solution. So if we're doing a penetration test of a web application, for example, and there's a WAF in place, it's very often that we can bypass that WAF. That doesn't mean that WAFs are useless. Sometimes it just means that they're not well configured, and sometimes it means that they've been possibly pushed into service in an area that's not ideal for where they're beneficial. But what an application layer firewall does, the way that it works, is you would place the WAF in front of the web application so that the traffic that flows from the user to the web server flows through the WAF. The WAF would be able to inspect that traffic. This could be literally an interim device, or it could be something software-based that sits on the web server itself. There is obviously a great number of software like this that can do this. So mod security is a basic example, but a common example, right up to dedicated devices that handle this kind of thing for you. But it sits between the user and the web application, inspects the traffic that goes through, and looks at the application layer to see what's happening. So instead of restricting traffic based on the IP address that it comes from or to, or instead of restricting traffic based on a port number or a protocol type, it'll restrict traffic based on the contents of the application layer. So for a web application, this is likely HTTP or encrypted HTTP, which would be HTTPS. And it can look at the actual request, the GET or POST request, its parameters, its body. It can be aware of other HTTP verbs, so puts, those kinds of things. And it can be used to prevent certain types of requests being made through to web applications. There's, of course, a couple of Okay, it looks like I'm back. Okay, so with application firewalls, you can block in a couple of different ways. You can block using an allow list or a block list. With a block list, what you're effectively doing is trying to come up with a list of all possible bad inputs to the application. With an allow list, you're taking a different approach and you're saying, this is the type of data that the application is allowing, and if it doesn't fit into this type of data, then don't allow it. That could be quite granular, so that could be type as in literally like, is it an integer, is it a string, those kinds of things. It can be in terms of things like the specific characters that are allowed, certain protocols, those kinds of things. Very often web application firewalls are set up using a block list, and that block list is somewhat incomplete. And that's where some WAFs get their bad reputation for not being great, because they're possible to be bypassed. Not necessarily saying that using a block list would be easy. It's just like, oh, hey, you just need to, write a more complete block list and you'll be fine. What I'd really recommend where possible is for your application firewalls to be allow list based. We are granularly saying what the expected type of data is and then blocking everything else. So especially for some simple inputs, things like integers, that can be quite simple. If it is not an integer, then don't allow it. But it can get more complex, especially if you're allowing rich text input, if you're using more complex protocols, so things like JSON data or XML data, and to some degree can make it more complex. But this is the intention of application layer firewalls, to get a more granular connection where you'll be able to filter traffic more specifically. Now, for web application firewalls being weak, what I wanted to do was show you several payloads that would effectively do the same thing from a web application point of view. So these are some very basic SQL injection payloads. Now, SQL injection is a wonderful vulnerability that's been around for a very, very long time. It's first released, I guess the first written version that I've seen, first documented article talking about SQL injection was back in 1998. So it's been around for a very, very long time. But it still does crop up. TalkTalk got hit by an SQL injection attack in 2015. The Illinois State Board of Elections got hit in 2016. And they come up every now and again. But it's a good example of a potentially high-impact vulnerability that's relevant to web applications. So just in case you're unfamiliar with SQL injection, it's an attack that you would perform against a web application, so a website or some online hosted application where it is interacting with a database, and you can cause the database to perform actions that weren't intended. So typically this would be things like login bypass, or it might be disclosing information that they weren't supposed to. So if a web application is, say for example, think of an e-commerce website. If there's a page that's supposed to display products, you might be able to use an SQL injection payload to do something like get it to display products and then list user passwords afterwards. Of course, there's an additional protection in place here. User passwords would have something like hashes to protect them if they were ever disclosed, that kind of thing. But it's a good vulnerability to look up. It's a great vulnerability to consider in this context. And is, of course, injection vulnerabilities are the #1 vulnerability in the OWASP top 10. So if you're looking at lists of vulnerabilities, it's very, very commonly mentioned. These payloads effectively all do the same thing. So the and 1 = 1 payload is a very simplified example of what we call blind Boolean injection. But I've given these 4 examples here because they all do the same thing, but they're all very, very different. So if you were to try and write a block list that says block all possible inputs that are of this type, if you were to say, okay, block and 1 = 1, well, we could change the input to be and A = A or something like that. Very often, threat actors will want to use comments. That's what the 2 hyphens are, or the hash symbol on the second line. They're comments to alter the logic of the query being executed. But as you can see, the threat actor has a lot of options to perform the same action. We're just looking for a Boolean true response in this particular case, and all 4 of these payloads do the same thing from the attacker's point of view. But from the web application firewall's point of view, if it hasn't been given the logic to block all of these payloads, it's going to miss one. And that's what we talk about web application firewall bypasses. So another technology, great, definitely something to look at, but not something to be relied upon if you're using it in its default configuration or if you're using it with a simple block list. You need to be trained a little bit more granularly than that. And then finally, of course, I wouldn't be able to talk about firewalls unless I talked about firewall configuration reviews or firewall security reviews. Firewalls have access control lists and they should be reviewed. How frequently you do it depends on essentially how frequently you make changes to the network and those kinds of systems. But very often organizations will install a firewall, set it up, and then leave it running because it's been configured and it's working. And what you need to do is, as you make network changes, is regularly review those access control lists. So you hear it with penetration testing all the time where it's like, oh, you should have a pen test at least annually or on any major system change. Well, when you're changing the internal corporate network, you should be checking that the firewall access control list is still relevant and there's not been something snuck through unintentionally. Very often with access control list reviews, we find things where maybe a rule has been put in place for testing and then never removed, or a rule was set up based on how the network was at one point, but it's changed over time and that rule is no longer relevant, or generally just allows more access than necessary. But we take a look down the access control lists. I've just grabbed some sample ACEs, access control entities, from a Cisco device here just to demonstrate. But we'll look through each one of these and see whether the rule is appropriate. And it depends on the context of the firewall, what it's been used for, where in the network it is, the devices that it's protecting, those kinds of things. But pretty much all of these rules would be bad for one reason or another. All of the rules allow effectively any source IP address, so that's something to be wary of. The second to last rule allows any traffic through. And then there's a rule after that which denies some traffic. But firewalls typically execute their rules from top to bottom, matching on any rule and then not processing the others. This is a bit of a mess of access control lists. I think anyone who knows Cisco devices would be pulling their hair out of this. But it's just a slide to remind me to say, you should have your access control lists reviewed. And anytime you make major network changes, changes to the architecture, changes to where devices are, VLANs, those kinds of things, you should get somebody to take a look at the ACLs, make sure that they're still relevant to what you're trying to protect. And if you're looking at things like strict segmentation, then the more granular you can get these ACEs, access control entries, the better. And that's it. That's my 45-minute rant on firewalls over. My gosh, would you believe that you could talk for 45 minutes straight about firewalls? Very sorry for the network glitch we had partway through that. Hopefully you stuck with us to the end. If you've got to rush off and go to another engagement, then that's cool. Our social media links are below. Feel free to fire us questions either directly to me or to Sakama on Twitter or LinkedIn, and we'll pick those up later on. And thank you for listening. If anyone's got questions now, fire them into the chat. I'll hang around for a few minutes and I'll answer those questions, but if not, we'll pick them up later over social networks. Thanks.